Welcome to Your Lettings Journey, a brand new podcast that's essential listening for landlords with property in North London. Now, everyone will have their own unique landlord journey, from the way they get into property to the way they hang up or pass on their keys, and then all the different decisions in between. But along the way, we're all faced by many of the same issues and potential pitfalls. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Romesh, and together we have a lifetime of experience as landlords, letting agents and tenants that we want to share with you to help you navigate your lettings journey.
So if you're an experienced landlord wanting to make sure that you're keeping on the right side of all the rules and regulations, or if you're completely new to this game and don't know where to start, then this is the podcast for you.
Your Lettings Journey is produced by Belvoir Enfield and Central Housing Group. For more information, visit belvoir.co.uk/Enfield and centralhousinggroup.com.
This week on Your Lettings podcast, we enter the world of HMOs, often seen as areas where you're going to generate much better yield on your properties.
We frequently get asked the question in the current climate from existing landlords, should I invest in a HMO? Sometimes they're wondering whether they should exit their buy-to-let portfolio and sell up and move into HMOs, and some are sort of looking at getting a HMO in addition.
But is it something that everyone should be getting into? Okay, Romesh, let's get started then. HMOs, houses of multiple occupation. So, yeah, this is something that I've always had investors talking to me about, but now I seem to get more normal landlords asking me about. What do you think?
Yeah, I've experienced the same, to be honest, Rachel. I think the normal landlords have been hit with mortgage rate increases, Section 24, and property prices increasing. So buy-to-let isn't as attractive as it has been in the past. So landlords are approaching me and saying, look, I've got this 3-bed semi-detached house. Can we not use this as a 5-bedroom HMO? So a classic example is a property in Edmonton. Typically, you'd get something like between 17 and 1900 renting it privately. Based on room rates, you're looking at £700 a room times 5. That's £3,500 on the face of it. They're saying to me, well, look, this is a great return compared to what you're helping me to achieve at the moment. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the sort of top level thing that people will come to me and say as well, as like, Rachel, why am I renting this out? My God, I'm leaving money on the table. Rach, what do I do about it? And it's one of those things. I understand how that would be attractive to people, but you really need to start breaking down some of those figures. So if you take your standard property in Enfield, standard 3-bedroom property in Enfield, yes, you may have 2 reception rooms that are going to be a decent size, but your 3rd bedroom upstairs, chances are that's a single, and in many cases, it's a box room. So it's not going to meet the criteria to be able to rent it out. So I think it has to be 6.5 square meters for a single.
Yeah. And
even if it does meet that criteria, it's not going to get £700 for it. And also it's probably going to be harder to let than the other rooms. And at the same time, if you take away both of the reception rooms, a lot of places have that little galley kitchen.
Yeah.
So people are then cooking and eating in their bedrooms, which is not the most attractive arrangement for people. So would that still mean that you get your £700? Possibly not.
No.
And then, just to go on a little bit, but then if you've got 5 people in your property, then you need to make sure that you have 5 of all the facilities. So, sorry, not 5. 5. You need
5.
2 of all the facilities. Yeah, it's a big house. So you need to make sure that you have 2 bathrooms and 2 toilets. And you need to make sure you've got 2 cookers and 2 fridge freezers. And then you need extra space because you've got to have a certain amount of worktop space. So you kind of end up reducing it down to 4 bedrooms, let's say, charging a bit less for one of those bedrooms. So then you're not looking at 3,500, you're looking at maybe 2,005. And on top of that, you've got additional costs. So it's important to run through all of that when people are getting excited about £3,500.
True. No, I think you're right. You can't always count that 5th bedroom, the box room, but you're still looking at potentially much better income than you would if a normal straightforward let, I would have thought.
Well, you are. I mean, it will be up. So let's say you're getting 1,900 for your 3-bedroom house if you rent it all out as a house. Let's say you're hitting the 2,005 for having 4 sharers and therefore not having to have an extra bathroom and all the rest of it. But on top of your 2005, you have to consider the costs that you're likely to have with it as well. Because if you rent your property out on a room by room basis, then invariably you are paying the council tax, you're paying the utilities, you're paying for a TV license, you're paying for broadband, you're paying for a cleaner for the communal areas, you're paying for a gardener. So all of that eats into it, and it's just so much more hassle.
You said something really interesting there, Rachel. You said utilities. Now, obviously, cost of living crisis, the way things have gone through the roof. If I had a HMO, I really need to know that I can control those costs in terms of those utilities and the usage by tenants, because obviously that would really, I would have thought, eat into that margin that we would be able to create.
Oh, definitely it does, and particularly now. There's no two ways around it. Yes, it does. Yeah. And a lot of that comes down to, do you get on with your tenants? How sensible are they? How is your relationship? Are they turning on the heating full blast and then leaving all the windows open? And it's one of those things that's just generally more difficult, because you may have one person who really feels the cold, and another person who's just, who loves the cold. And so they're going to want different things. So yes, it is difficult. Yes, it is complicated. And actually, talking about utilities, one of the things that a lot of people who rented out their properties on a room by room basis didn't realise was that when they gave the rebates that we've had recently, that have just stopped, the monthly rebates on gas and electric, that money should have gone to the tenants if their rent included bills.
That's interesting.
That's an interesting one, isn't it? Yes. It is. I mean, you do get people who don't include bills or don't include gas and electric. I remember a long time ago, they were going to make it legal that you had to include it. I can't remember what happened there. For me, I wouldn't touch it if it's not included, because it just gets too complicated.
Too complicated to bill and invoice, and you've got people coming and going at different times, I guess. Yes,
because how do you prove who's using what? And if everyone, I saw an advert the other day on Spare Room, and it was saying, I pay for all of the bills except for the gas, which last time was one of the tenants has sorted out and is arranging. And last month it was £84 a person. And I thought, I wouldn't get involved in that if it was me. If I shower at the gym every day, but somebody else is showering twice a day in the house, or I'm only there overnight to sleep, but somebody else is working at home all day long, and it has to be heated all the time, I'm going to be paying for their no. So I wouldn't do it.
It sounds like you almost need to go back to the old days, where you have a little coin meter in each room, and people put a 50p in and turn it around. It sounds like it's going back to that, really.
Yeah, remind me not to be in one of your properties.
I've seen those over the years ago, where in old ex-HMOs, where you see those little machines on the wall, which were to give, I think it was electric at those days.
I mean, that was one of the things they were talking about before, was each room having its own meter in it, so you could accurately see how much energy each tenant had used. But that's fine for their individual bedrooms, but it doesn't cover the communal areas, so that doesn't work. I did go into a property once, not one of mine and not one I took on, where there was a cage around the boiler controls, and there was a note next to it saying, "Don't touch this. If you touch this, you'll be asked to leave." Okay, so that landlord was clearly managing his costs, but not something I would want to be involved in.
No, but I guess on the other type of HMO, where you've got that smaller sharer type HMO, you don't have to pay the bills. You can make those tenants sort of, if they come as a group, as sharers, they would then pay for those bills themselves and organise that themselves directly.
Well, it depends. It depends on the tenancy agreement you give them. So if they're still on a room by room basis, then the bills are yours. But if they're on a single tenancy, then absolutely they're just like a standard family, if you like. That all responsibility is theirs. So it depends on your setup to start with. Sure. But again, if you're letting it out to sharers and they're on one tenancy agreement, then you're not going to be charging £700 a room.
No, absolutely. You won't be able to achieve that. Agreed. So in terms of other costs for licensing, you've got to have these HMO licenses, a mandatory license or an additional license. So just to sort of clarify for listeners, really, a mandatory license is where you've got a house HMO with 5 or more people who are sharing facilities, and there's that's when you need a mandatory license, essentially, and an additional license where you've got 3 or more people with 2 different households who are having to share, basically, facilities. And that would apply when you've got 3 to sort of 5 or 4. In terms of costs, is there much difference in your experience, Rachel, between a mandatory and additional?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there is a difference, and it particularly depends on which borough that you're in. So the mandatory, I believe, is the same wherever you are, but additional licensing, the costs will vary from borough to borough. But they are costs that you pay every 5 years, I think, for both. So it's not like you have a monthly fee for it, but it's something to be considered. The more important bit about licensing is the actually bringing it up to health and safety and fire standards.
Yeah,
and the costs of that are definitely more onerous if you have a mandatory license than if you have a standard additional one. I mean, particularly in terms of actually transforming your room, because as I say, if you've got 5 or more people, you need to have 2 bathrooms, 2 ovens, 2 sinks, all that kind of stuff. So the actual setup is much more expensive from that point of view. But for a lot of the people who talk to me, they've got an existing property and they're wanting to change that into, they're thinking, if I get sharers into this existing property,
right,
am I going to get a huge amount more money, rather than necessarily, I'm thinking of buying one. I'm thinking of buying a big house and changing it. Because to be honest, a lot of the people who talk to me about, I want to get into HMOs, are thinking they want to buy HMOs certainly outside of London.
Right.
They're wanting to buy them up north or something, because the outlay is that much smaller.
Yeah.
So people are thinking of giving up their buy-to-lets in London. A couple of the ones that I've spoken to give up their buy-to-let in London and invest in something much larger and do it as an HMO somewhere cheaper.
I mean, there's a lot of costs involved when you do go down the HMO route, especially in terms of getting the property up to standard. Fire alarm systems. I mean, you talked about bathrooms, kitchen facilities and cooking facilities, but there's also the health and safety stuff in terms of fire doors everywhere, fire alarms.
No, exactly. That's what I meant. The health and safety requirements, if you're in a mandatory one, are much greater than if you're in an additional one. So you say, the alarm systems are different. Do you need emergency lighting? All that kind of stuff is different. So I think the key thing is you need to think about, what is your journey? Yeah. How does this fit in? Because if you are looking at getting a mandatory, a large HMO, then there's the financial implications of that. And so you don't want to do that kind of thing if it's something that you're only going to have for, 3, 4, 5 years. That's something that you would ideally want to have for a long time.
Yeah.
So one of the key things is to say, well, actually, is there the market for this? And that's one of the interesting things, because if you look at it from a tenant point of view, and you say, anywhere that you go to look at a 1-bedroom flat, let's say you're looking at a 1-bedroom flat, you want to live on your own, that's going to be double the price of a room share, or a house share rather. It's going to be double the price. And if you're saving up for a deposit for somewhere, and given that the deposits keep rising, then do I really want to go down the 1-bedroom independent flat area or route, or do I want to just get myself a room in a really nice house? So I think we're seeing an increase in a number of people who are considering HMOs where previously they wouldn't have done. And so you need to check that there is the demand for it. But I think if you look on any of the specifically the room portals, you'll see that there's a number of properties out there which would suggest that, there is a growing requirement for HMOs.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about knowing your market, I guess there's 3 markets that I would always consider: your professionals, your students, and your sort of, what's the better word of it? Lower income sort of housing benefit type lets, really. But each of those are somewhat totally different in terms of the standard you've got to work to and how you sort of provide that property and the expectation from each one of those groups, really.
Definitely. I saw one on TV the other day, and it's one of those bad landlord, bad tenant type shows. And this landlord had a 6-bedroom HMO. I think it was 6-bedroom HMO, but they were all single rooms and they were all let to vulnerable people, and they seemed incredibly basic.
Yeah.
It's not somewhere that I would ever personally want to live, and it's not something that you would,
Sure.
Yeah, it's a very specific market. So you do need to know if you're going to have a 5-bedroom house, as we were talking about earlier on, with just the galley kitchen, and everyone eating in their bedrooms, you need to think about, well, who are the people that are going to want to live in that kind of situation? Or are they people who are going to want to have a lounge and have some kind of family community feel, somewhere they can sit and eat their food, somewhere they can relax and invite friends back to, and that sort of thing. So you need to know, A, is there demand? B, is there a market? And exactly what is that market? And is that a market that you're comfortable dealing with?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But look, okay, putting that all aside, I still want to give this a go. What should I do first? Obviously, I've looked at my market. I've looked at the cost involved. And there's obviously an issue to think about. Are you going to buy an existing HMO? Or are you going to go out and buy it and create a HMO? So if we go down that route and you're going to go out and buy a HMO, what would you say the things are we need to be looking at to go out and buy a property to convert?
So buying an existing one or convert? I thought you said we were buying an existing.
Buying a property to convert into a HMO, basically.
I think all the things we've already said. So is there a market? Do you have the finances?
Yeah.
I'd also check whether you need to have planning for it. So are you buying I think it's 7+ room HMO, in which case, yeah, you definitely need planning. Or are you in an Article 4 area?
Right.
In which case you need it for a smaller HMO. So I think about that planning. I think definitely, because I think there's a lot of councils who are very conscious about HMOs are kind of destroying the communities.
Yeah.
And so not wanting to have as many of them. So that's something you definitely need to look into.
I mean, from what I've read and heard, Article 4 zones, areas which are designated as Article 4, are particularly difficult to get new HMOs agreed in, because obviously the planning restrictions are there to try and protect that locality. So I would have thought, if I was looking to get into buying a HMO and buying a property and converting it, I would probably be very cautious about Article 4 areas, because it's going to be particularly difficult.
Definitely you should be. Definitely. If you need any kind of planning, you should be careful. But a lot of people just don't know about Article 4, because a lot of people, they just have the headline that you said earlier on, I can turn this 3-bed into a 5-bed. I know that the average room rent in Enfield is £700. I'm going to make 3,500, and they don't do the background on it.
Yeah.
I think the other key thing is, when we were talking last week about guaranteed rents, and I mentioned an HMO opening up in my road and being very concerned about how is this going to impact me and life on my little street. I think that's something that landlords also need to be aware of, because it is something that a lot of people think, and a lot, there's going to be more fly tipping, there's going to be more noise, there's more comings and goings, there's more cars on the street, It's generally not something that people want. So the
sad reality is that not all landlords do consider it from that perspective, because often they're going into it just from a financial impact. They're thinking, I want to invest in this, I want to make some money, and this is better than my buy-to-lets. And I suspect that a lot will overlook that point, Rachel, as much as you're right.
They overlook it until the point that they're actually getting those complaints, until the point that, they then have the council saying, you need to sort this out.
Yeah. I think that's... sorry.
No. I was going to say, or until one of the things that always concerns me, because we've got a couple of HMOs that we manage, and you have to find the right people to fit that property. So we're very much, we don't do the 6 single bedrooms, basic facilities, cage over the thermostat we don't do any of that kind of stuff. We've got nice houses that we like to think we would live in ourselves.
Yeah.
And so they have a lounge, they have a community feel, and we're very careful about who we put into them. So we have, for example, one property that is it's a 5-bed, and it's got young professional sharers in it. They're all, I think the oldest one is, 30. And when it comes to finding tenants there, so we had one of them leave. They've all been there now, I think, for 4 years, the ones that are there at the moment, but we had one leave. And so we were very careful. This has to be somebody coming in who matches these people, who's going to fit in well. And we had a 52-year-old woman apply. And we said, they're all very young in this property. And she said, oh, no, I'm young at heart. Yeah, I'm 52, but you would never know it. I don't look it and I don't act it. So we suggested this to tenants. We put this to tenants. This lady has applied, and they're just like, no, Rachel, no. I don't care how young she thinks she is. She's 52. So yes, there's that kind of thing. You need to get people who get on, because the minute they don't get on, or if you put a bad egg in, the discontent can spread. So,
Sure.
Okay, this lady might just have not been part of their little group, but they kind of depend on each other. They rely on each other. They are friends and they have that bond. So they're more likely to stay. They're more likely to look after the place well. She might just have not quite fitted in. But the worst case scenario is you get somebody in who is actually a negative force.
Yeah.
Because that discontent can spread quite quickly. And then you start getting the turnover, the people that don't care about the property. And if people leave because somebody is spreading bad vibes, it then becomes harder to let that run. So not just that you have a void period, but actually it's harder to then get people in and to get people staying. So you get all the additional costs as well.
No, I think what you said is great. It shows that you're careful with your tenant selection, which is really key and important. But so if I go out and buy a HMO 200 miles away, how am I going to ensure that I can achieve that sense of community within that HMO so that everybody's happy to be there, wants to be there, and will look after it like their own home, and just have a sense of, that they're almost friends and they can rely on each other? How do you do that?
It's much the same as our landlords do with us. They're trusting us to find the right people. So if you buy something that's down the road in Enfield, or you buy something that's in Hull, you've got to rely on the agent that you're using to put people in your property, to manage your property. And that's actually quite a key thing nowadays, because you hear so much about these rent-to-rent companies that are springing up. So we get calls quite regularly from companies saying, oh, do you have any large properties that you're struggling to let? Or do you do company lets? Like, when you say company, do you mean you have employees, or do you mean that we're renting it to you and you're finding other people?
Yeah.
And invariably it is the rent-to-rent model. And again, it's very attractive for landlords to think, oh, okay, so maybe not the 3,500, but they're going to give me £3,000 a month, and I don't need to convert it, and I don't need to manage it. I don't need to pay any agency fees. That sounds like a fabulous idea.
Yeah. I mean, I think that with those rent-to-rent models, would I be right in saying they sort of stack them in and stack them high to sort of just make it from a numbers perspective work? And that's where it sort of is really focused on, and nothing else.
Yeah, I'd say it really depends on the company. There are some very, very good rent-to-rent companies out there. They do exist. Yeah. The problem is that there's a lot of training and courses and property information out there for people to say, okay, well, you can't afford to invest in a property of your own. Here is an easy way to get into property.
Yeah.
And which is very true in London. If you imagine the cost of buying something that you could make an HMO is it's crazy.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got a few £1,000s in the bank, basically is what they're saying, so long as you can afford the first month's rent that you're promising to the landlord, and have a second month as backup, then happy days, carry on, set yourself up as a rent-to-rent company and, sign up your landlords and get income in that way. I'm trivialising a little bit, but that is effectively what they're saying. And so I'm not going to say some landlords fall for it, but you need to, in the same way we were talking about guaranteed rent and people doing their due diligence on the agency, you need to do your due diligence on that rent-to-rent company. How long have they been in place? What's their background? Do they have the finances to cover it if your property is actually empty?
Yeah.
Because there were certainly stories of a few that went to the wall during COVID when people started losing their jobs and everything else. And then they didn't have the money to cover this guaranteed rent. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely, Rachel. I mean, I'm sure you would have heard, and some of our listeners would have heard about the case that was a high profile rent repayment order case with Rakusen versus, I think it was Kensington Property Company or Kensington Property Limited. And this case was essentially where the tenants were taking a claim against the landlord of the property, which is Rakusen, saying that you have not got a license for this property. Therefore, I'm entitled to claim with all the rent I paid. And then the landlord had given the property to this rent-to-rent company and in his eyes had passed all responsibilities to this rent-to-rent company. So that was quite a high-profile case. In the end, the rent-to-rent company were found to be responsible for organising the licence because they'd taken over full responsibility. So it's something to be aware of.
Yeah. I think originally the court said that this superior landlord, the owner, was responsible, and then he challenged it, and they said, no, it's the rent-to-rent company. And then I think, didn't the tenants challenge it or something? And then they came back and said, no.
Yes, it went all the way to the High Court, didn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that sends a bit of a mixed signal, really. I kind of think, yes, the rent-to-rent company are the people that got that wrong. But I'm also a bit concerned that it sends the wrong message to landlords that you can hand over your property and lose, and you're not responsible for things. And from a tenant's point of view, I have mixed thoughts on a tenant's point of view, actually, because I guess the reason, there was one in Southgate, for example. There was an example recently that I saw in Southgate, and this lady was saying that they'd taken a room, her and her partner had taken a room in this HMO, and I think it was 6-bed, but it turned out that there were 12 people living there in the end. Okay. And although they had an ensuite in their bathroom, the toilet broke in there and the landlord never came to fix it. And so you had 12 people sharing a toilet or sharing a bathroom or something. And they were told to go for a rent, or they would suggest, that was it. The rent-to-rent company, when they contacted the council, the rent-to-rent company then issued everybody with a Section 21, but of course the Section 21 wasn't valid because they didn't have a license to start with. And so the tenants were being told, take a rent repayment, take them to court to get your money back. But she was saying, well, there was no point in us doing that because they didn't have the money to pay us back. And that, I kind of think, well, in that situation, the landlord has probably had money for that.
Yes.
The tenants have been massively inconvenienced and had a hideous experience and been paying rent, I believe. So they should be getting their money back from somebody.
Yeah.
But they didn't then do it. But on the other hand, sometimes it's like the deposit side of things. And I get the feeling that some people are just, the landlord has made a mistake. And I'm not saying that landlords are allowed to make mistakes, but sometimes you think the landlord has made a mistake. You've still had a very nice property to live in, very safe and very nice property to live in. But after a year, you're now asking for a year's rent back. And that leaves a little bit of a bad taste.
Especially when it's on a technicality.
On a technicality. Yes, exactly. I mean, so with deposit. Yeah, there's also, we won't go down the route, but yes, it can be a technicality, and it's like the ambulance chasing solicitors and stuff that will help people do things. And you just kind of think, actually, it leaves a bad taste, but it also leaves a bad taste that maybe landlords can say, I'm giving you my property and I'm just going to look away and pretend that I don't know what's going on. And I just think maybe some of that. So yes, I also absolutely a bit odd.
Yeah. So rent-to-rent schemes, beware, be wary and do your due diligence, I think would be the key advice if you're entering into those.
And similarly, for any tenant, do your checking as well. Do your checking before you sign up with a property in a shared house. But I like shared houses. I lived in a shared house when I was younger and I think they are great. So yeah, I'm a big fan of them, but you just need to be careful who you're renting to, who you're renting from, and if there's a middleman in between. Yeah.
I mean, I was getting call after call during COVID where landlords there was hotels, bed and breakfasts, HMOs, houses, rooms. We were being offered stuff left, right, and centre because they were all sat empty. Everybody obviously fled their homes to go back to family or somewhere where they felt safer and not sharing. So it really
exactly.
It did expose that HMO market, but we'd like to think that's a once in a lifetime sort of situation occurrence. Really,
no, definitely. I don't want to see that again in my lifetime. Thank you very much. But actually, one thing that has happened recently, because you said at the beginning about people with their buy-to-lets and the finances and not making sense, and therefore, looking at HMOs. I think the same thing applies from a landlord's perspective on HMOs as well. The finances are actually that much harder for them as well. So they've got the same increase in mortgages. They've got colossal increases in utilities. And then in some areas you have the disaggregation thing, which I won't talk about too much because I know that they had a consultation on that ended at the end of March, and I'm not sure what's happened as a result of that. But it's basically where they will, what do they call the valuation office, I think it is.
Right.
The VOA, Valuation Office Agency, I think. And they will take a property and say it was a council tax band D, E, what have you. But then because it's broken down into rooms, and I think each room has to have its own bathroom facilities or something, and then they council tax ban that separately. So then instead of being you've got a D or E for the house, but then you've got A's for every room within it or something along those lines. So it's just, again, something to be very wary of. I don't know of it happening in our areas, but it has happened in other areas, in London as well. So for landlords as well, for HMO landlords as well, the costs have gone up too. And one thing that struck me as really interesting recently, I was looking at spare room and looking at the number of rooms available and the costs of them and all that sort of thing. And in Enfield, on this particular day, there were 41 rooms available. Just rooms, not flats or whole houses or anything, just rooms, 41. But only 13 of those were with live-out landlords. So everything else was a live-in landlord. So 28 or whatever that is were live-in landlords. And I thought, I don't have the stats from however long ago, but that strikes me as considerably more than you would ordinarily think there would be. So there's a lot more people out there who are letting out the spare room in their property, presumably to also deal with mortgage increases and everything else. And there were also a number of people who were renting, who were tenants, and there was a couple who turned their sitting room into a bedroom. And I thought, I wonder how many of those properties are actually now HMOs.
Yes, really good point. I think
and the landlord doesn't know.
Well, it's the onus is on the landlord or agent to make sure they do their regular visits, inspections, I guess, because you won't pick this up if you don't attend your properties and get your head around the door and so in the rooms, really, will you? No, it's a really interesting point. I'm sure there will be because of people are suffering with the financial crisis, utilities, etc.
And that's one of those things about self-managing as well. So I know a lot of landlords, or I encounter a lot of landlords who self-manage, and I say to them, when was the last time you went round to look at your property? And it's like, oh well, yeah, it's been a couple of years. I'll go round if ever there's an issue, but I probably haven't seen them since Christmas 21. Just like, oh my days. But on an HMO, you can't do that. I mean, you shouldn't do that on any property, but on an HMO, yes, we talked about cleaning and the responsibility, therefore, for the communal areas and making sure that they're good and they're okay. But also, you're responsible for making sure that alarms and things, emergency lighting and all that sort of stuff is working. So, I mean, we visit the communal areas of our properties every month.
Yes.
But then we go to the individual rooms every 3 months. And so again, when it comes to, do you have one tenancy agreement or do you have 5?
So, I mean, look, if you do use an agent, it's going to eat into your profit. How about if we buy outside of London? I mean, you're going to be looking at a much cheaper purchase price. If you buy outside London, your mortgages are still hard to obtain, but your capital outlay is going to be considerably lower, I would have thought. But
yes, I'm sure we said that. We said that. Anyway, but yes, it is going to be much cheaper outside of London. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I think we probably covered HMOs as much as we're going to today in this episode. to sum up, Rachel, have you got any final sort of words you wanted to just sum up with?
I'd say the key thing is be careful and do your homework. Don't get too dazzled by the figures. I think there are 480,000 HMOs across England. I think it's England. I think there's not 9,000 and something in Enfield, which was a figure that's baffled me. I didn't know there were anywhere near as many. So there is a demand out there. There are still landlords who do it, but the numbers are decreasing. But additionally, make sure you get the right financing stuff as part of your due diligence. It's not just do the numbers stack up and everything else. Make sure you have the right mortgage and the right insurance, because I believe the mortgages are getting harder, like everybody else's are, in terms of do the figures stack up, but also I think the bank's criteria or the lender's criteria for HMO landlords is also getting a bit stiffer. So I think some people are actually looking at, do you have experience of this? Or they're asking for a bigger deposit or what have you. So I would say just make sure you have the right mortgage, because the implications of getting the wrong one, are maybe things you don't want to, or areas you don't want to go into. And also from an insurance point of view, make sure you actually do have cover for this to be a shared house rather than just a single family house. And that comes down to basic things like even appliance insurance. Because if you have appliance, we've literally had somebody turn up to fix a washing machine and actually say to me, I really shouldn't be fixing this because we don't have this down as a shared house. So,
wow.
yeah. So that kind of thing is just make sure you look at the fine detail and make sure if you need planning, that you have planning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very good tips. I'm just going to add to that, Rachel. My thoughts were, be very careful of buying in Article 4 areas if you're going to buy a property to convert. Make sure you do your due diligence on what your market is going to be, working, student, DSS. It is definitely more lucrative, but you've got to look at it at the end of the day. Is it worth it? Because there's a lot more work involved. And if you're new to HMOs, I would buy an existing one, and I wouldn't, get involved in creating a new one. Basically, it's a whole new ball game in itself.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's
HMOs.
Yeah, covered.
We're done.
Okay. See you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
We'd also love to hear from you about any topics you'd particularly like us to discuss. Please send an email to yourlettingsjourney@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, and see you for the next episode of Your Lettings Journey. Goodbye.
Goodbye.